The ceiling of the hospital room was white and plain. I had been staring at it for 3 days, counting the tiny cracks the way you do when you have nothing else to do. My abdomen still ached from the surgery. The doctors said the operation had gone well, but my body did not feel like it agreed. Every small movement reminded me that I was still healing. My phone was the only window I had to the outside world, and I checked it more than I should have. That Tuesday morning, I reached for it at exactly 7:42 a.m. There were 2 unread messages. The first was from my sister, asking how I was feeling. I smiled and set it aside. The second message stopped me cold. My stomach tightened before I even finished reading it. Your position at Harlow & Steel has been terminated effective immediately. HR will send your severance details by end of business today. I read it 4 times. Then a 5th. 22 years. I had given 22 years of my life to that company. And they had ended it with 1 text message. No phone call. No meeting. No warning. Just 11 cold words on a screen while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. I set my phone face down on the bed tray and breathed slowly. The heart monitor beeped steadily, not knowing or caring that my whole life had just shifted. I thought maybe I had misread it. I picked up the phone again. I had not misread anything. The message was still there, still just as short, still just as brutal. Then a second notification came in. It was from my direct boss, Marcus Webb. My hand shook slightly as I opened it. His message read, "I'm sure you understand these decisions are never easy. The company is restructuring. Best of luck going forward." That was everything he had to say. Marcus had barely spoken to me in months. He had started holding team meetings without me, redirecting my project reports through junior staff, and canceling our weekly check-ins without rescheduling. I had noticed. Of course I had noticed. But I had told myself it was the pressure of the company's new direction. I convinced myself it wasn't personal. I was wrong. It was very personal. Lying there in that hospital bed, tube still in my arm, I felt something rise inside me. It was not sadness. It wasn't panic either. It was something quieter and more focused. I pressed my lips together and stared at the ceiling again. My name is Nadia Thornton. I was 53 years old and had spent more than 2 decades building Harlow & Steel's client operations division from the ground up. When I joined, the division had 6 staff members and 4 clients. When I was fired from that hospital bed, we had 41 staff and over 60 active clients across 3 industries. I had fought for every single contract, every new hire, and every budget increase. The surgery I was recovering from was a planned procedure. I had informed HR and Marcus 6 weeks in advance. I had documented everything, handed over full project notes, and set up my team to run smoothly while I was gone. I had done everything right. And they had fired me while I was still attached to a hospital drip. My daughter Petra drove 2 hours to be with me when I told her. She sat at the edge of my hospital bed, her eyes wet with anger on my behalf. She wanted to call a lawyer immediately. I asked her to wait. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me was already thinking clearly. I needed information before I needed action. I needed to understand exactly what had happened and why before I made a single move. The hospital discharged me 4 days after the termination text. I went home to my apartment, which suddenly felt very quiet. Petra had offered to stay, but I told her I needed space to think. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, cold tea, and a growing stack of printed emails. I had kept copies of everything. Not because I had expected this, but because I had always been organized. Over the next 2 days, I read through months of emails with fresh eyes. I was no longer reading them as a busy executive. I was reading them as someone searching for a pattern. The pattern was not hard to find. Starting about 7 months earlier, my projects had been quietly reassigned without my knowledge. Meeting invites had stopped including me. There were hidden email threads where my name appeared only as a subject, not a participant. The most unsettling discovery was a message where Marcus had told two junior managers that the client relationship model would be shifting toward a more dynamic leadership profile. He had sent that email 3 months ago, then smiled at me in the hallway that very same week. I closed my laptop. The question was simple: who was going to inherit the work I had spent 22 years building? The recovery was harder at home than in the hospital. At the hospital, nurses came to check on me. At home, the silence was heavy. I moved slowly around the apartment, trying not to lift anything too heavy, trying to keep my body still while my mind ran at full speed. Some nights I could not sleep. I would lie awake replaying conversations from that office, wondering if I had missed signs I should have caught earlier. Self-doubt is a strange thing. It creeps in quietly and then speaks very loudly. I found myself wondering if I had become too comfortable, too confident. Whether I had been less sharp than I thought. Whether I had overestimated my own value to that company. Then one morning I opened LinkedIn and saw Marcus Webb's post. He had shared a major client announcement, a contract renewal I had personally negotiated 8 months before. He described it as a result of our team's innovative approach and fresh client strategy. He did not mention my name once. Every person who commented praised him. I screenshotted it. I saved it with a date stamp. And something shifted in me permanently that morning. I was done questioning myself. I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew exactly who I noticed. I made a decision to stop looking backward and start looking forward. I gave myself 2 days to feel everything fully. I cried once, properly, sitting on my bathroom floor with the shower running so no one could hear. Then I washed my face, made coffee, and opened a fresh document on my laptop. I started with what I knew. Our industry was shifting toward integrated data compliance, a complex area where very few companies had deep expertise. Harlow and Steele had relied on me to lead that work. Without me, they would struggle. I had never thought of that as leverage before. I thought about it now. I began researching Harlow and Steele's main competitor, Calverton Group. They were growing fast and had recently won 2 major public sector tenders. But their published reports showed weak compliance integration. They were winning contracts on price and relationships, but their delivery had significant gaps I could see clearly because I had spent years solving those exact problems. I spent 4 days building a detailed analysis of Calverton's strengths, weaknesses, and the opportunities they were missing. By the end, I understood their business almost as well as my own. I didn't know what I would do with that knowledge yet. But I felt stronger for having it. The accident that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was drafting a summary of a past client project, mostly for my own records, when I accidentally clicked the wrong contact in my email address book. Instead of sending it to my personal archive, I sent it to an external address. I realized my mistake immediately and felt a sharp sting of embarrassment. The reply came 40 minutes later. Ms. Thornton, I believe this found its way to me by accident. But I have to say, after reading it, I am genuinely glad it did. The depth of client management thinking in this summary is rare. I would very much like to have a conversation if you are open to it. Callum Voss, CEO, Calverton Group. I read the message 3 times. Callum Voss was not just any executive. He had built Calverton from a mid-sized consultancy into the fastest-growing firm in our sector. His reputation was sharp, strategic, and, from everything I had read, fair. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I typed a short, careful reply. I thanked him for his discretion and said I was open to a conversation. My hand was steady as I pressed send. The days between sending that reply and our scheduled meeting were the strangest of my life. I was still healing physically. I was still carrying the weight of betrayal. But something new was running underneath all of it, possibility. The clean kind that comes from a blank page rather than a closed door. I was cautious, though. I had learned not to trust easily. Callum Voss could have had many reasons for reaching out. He might have been curious about what I knew about Harlow and Steele. I wrote out my concerns carefully. I decided exactly what I would and would not share. I would reveal nothing that belonged to my former employer. No internal strategies, no client lists, no confidential pricing. What I would share was my own expertise and my own thinking. That belonged entirely to me. I also noticed something during my research. A compliance filing from one of Harlow and Steele's largest clients showed a discrepancy in reporting dates that did not match the project timeline I had personally overseen. Something had changed after my departure, and it was not a small error. I saved the documents and said nothing to anyone yet. I wanted to understand the full picture before making any moves at all. We met at a quiet restaurant near the river, the kind where conversations stay private. I arrived early and sat with water and a leather notebook. When Callum Voss walked in, I recognized him immediately. He was taller than his photos suggested, with a calm that comes from being genuinely comfortable with himself. He shook my hand without pretense. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said simply. "Thank you for your discretion," I replied. We spent the first 20 minutes in careful conversation. He asked thoughtful questions and I gave thoughtful answers. He was not trying to pull information from me. He was trying to understand how I thought. I noticed that, and it changed the atmosphere between us. By the time the food arrived, we had moved into a deeper discussion about industry direction, compliance integration challenges, and where the biggest client risks were emerging. I said nothing about Harlow and Steele's internal workings. I spoke only from my own experience and analysis. At one point, Callum leaned back and said, "You've been thinking about this longer than most people in our sector." It wasn't flattery, it was an observation, and he was right. I had been thinking about these problems for over 2 decades, and I finally had someone genuinely interested in what I found. Before the meeting ended, Callum mentioned a major project Calverton was preparing to pitch, a government infrastructure compliance review, the largest single contract in our sector that year. He said plainly that his team had strong relationships but lacked depth in technical compliance. He thought I could help fill that gap. I did not say yes immediately. I told him I needed time to consider. He nodded, gave me his card, and said the offer would remain open. There was no pressure. That told me a great deal about him. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Marcus Webb. I thought about that hospital text. I thought about 22 years of work and the LinkedIn post that erased my name from it. Then I thought about the government contract. I knew that space deeply. I had handled 2 similar projects at Harlow and Steele. More importantly, I knew Marcus was also preparing a pitch for the same contract. He planned to lead it personally. But the compliance section of any serious bid required exactly the kind of expertise that had just walked out of his building in a hospital gown. He simply did not know what he no longer had. I drove home and did not sleep until I had written down everything I was thinking. Within 2 weeks of my termination, former colleagues began reaching out. They came quietly through personal email or text, never through company channels. 3 were senior members of my team. One was Bex Okafor, a project coordinator who had worked directly under me for 6 years. Bex's message was careful but clear. She said the team was struggling. Projects I had managed were falling behind. Clients were asking questions that no one could answer confidently. Marcus had taken over the government contract pitch personally and was holding closed meetings that excluded the technical staff. She was worried about what was coming. Another message came from Aaron Slade, a former colleague who had moved departments the previous year. He told me Marcus was presenting my previous client strategy work as a new internal initiative he had personally developed. Aaron still had emails from 18 months ago where I had outlined that exact strategy in a board presentation. I thanked them both and saved every message carefully. I did not ask anyone to leak anything. But I told Bex that if she ever felt clients were being genuinely misled, keeping her own documentation was always her professional right. I meant it as guidance, not strategy. But I knew the truth had a way of finding its own direction without being pushed. I called Callum Voss the following Monday. I told him I was ready to discuss a consulting arrangement. He was straightforward. I would work as an independent strategic advisor on the government contract pitch, contributing my own professional expertise. Everything would be formalized through a consulting agreement. I would not be required to share any proprietary Harlow and Steele information. I signed the agreement on a Wednesday afternoon at my kitchen table. My tea was still warm this time. The work felt immediate. Calverton's pitch team was competent but narrow in their thinking. They had built a strong relationship argument but a weak technical one. Over 4 working sessions, I helped them restructure the compliance section into something genuinely rigorous. Every claim was supported by methodology. Every risk was anticipated and addressed. At one point, the lead bid writer, Finn Abra, looked up from his laptop and said, "Where has this kind of thinking been hiding?" I told him it hadn't been hiding. It had just been in the wrong building. Meanwhile, Hartwell Infrastructure, one of Harlow and Steele's most important accounts, reached out through a mutual contact. Their head of governance wanted to speak with me. She had questions about compliance decisions made after my departure that didn't match the framework we had built together. Vivian Park from Hartwell Infrastructure was sharp, experienced, and direct. We spoke for 40 minutes by phone. She did not ask me to criticize my former employer. She had questions about the methodology behind recent reporting decisions that did not match the framework we had established together over the years. I answered her questions based on my own documented work. I sent her copies of the original methodology documents I had created, all kept legitimately in my own files before my departure date. Everything I shared was mine to share. Before the call ended, Vivian said something I did not forget. "We trusted the framework because you built it, Nadia. We're not sure we trust what's replaced it." I did not reach out to Vivian again after that call. I did not need to. She was a professional who could draw her own conclusions from accurate information. I had done nothing wrong, broken no confidentiality, and stayed entirely within my professional rights. But I knew there would be consequences. Vivian Park was not the kind of person who sat quietly with unresolved concerns. She would act through the proper channels. That was simply who she was. And I respected it completely. Marcus Webb noticed. I knew he would eventually. The first sign came through Bex, who told me Marcus had called an urgent internal meeting about external interference in client relationships. He had not named me directly, but everyone in the room understood who he meant. Bex said his voice had been tight the way it got when he was anxious, but trying not to show it. The second sign came from Aaron Slade. Marcus had sent a company-wide email asking staff to report any contact with former employees seeking access to client or project information. The language made me sound like a threat. It was careful enough to avoid being defamatory, but the intent was obvious. What Marcus did not understand was that I had not contacted his clients. His clients had contacted me. I had shared only work that was mine to share. And I had carefully documented every exchange. Callum called me after the announcement circulated in industry channels. He asked if I was concerned. I told him no. I told him I had a clean record of every action since leaving Harlow and Steele. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. So have we." I filed that conversation away. We were both prepared. That was enough for now. Calverton submitted the government contract bid on a Friday afternoon. Finn Abra sent me a message saying the compliance section was the strongest they had ever produced. The bid team had a confidence they hadn't carried into previous pitches. I sat with that for a moment and felt quietly satisfied. The following week, Calverton published an announcement about a completed infrastructure project that had used similar compliance methodology. Callum had asked my permission to describe the approach in general terms without naming me. I agreed. The piece circulated in industry press and drew strong response. 3 separate contacts sent me the article asking if I was involved. I replied honestly to each one. I had contributed consulting expertise, nothing more. Hartwell Infrastructure formally notified Harlow and Steele that their account was under review. The letter cited concerns about methodology consistency since the recent leadership transition. Marcus could not respond without exposing exactly how my departure had been handled. Bex messaged me that evening. She said the office had been very quiet all day. Marcus had left early and not replied to messages. She added one more line, "People are starting to ask real questions here, Nadia." I read it twice, put my phone down, and went to sleep without any trouble. I spent the following 2 weeks building what I came to think of as my professional record. I gathered everything. Every presentation I had authored. Every client report with my name on it. Every email thread showing my thinking, my strategy, and my decisions. I organized it all into a clean, dated portfolio. I included the LinkedIn post where Marcus had announced the client renewal without crediting me, and the original emails proving I had personally closed that deal. I included the compliance methodology documents for Hartwell and 3 other accounts. I included my performance reviews from the previous 5 years, all outstanding. I was not building a weapon. I was building a record. A weapon is designed to attack. A record is designed to tell the truth. I wanted the truth to be clearly visible and completely undeniable. Callum reviewed the portfolio at my request. He said it was the most thorough professional documentation he had seen from an individual consultant. He asked to share portions with Calverton's legal team on a confidential basis. I agreed. I also received a message from Harlow & Steele's legal department asking me to confirm I had not shared confidential company information externally. I replied in full detail that I had not. My lawyer reviewed it before I sent it. 6 weeks after my termination, I received an unexpected invitation from the Regional Infrastructure Standards Board, a neutral industry body. They were hosting a roundtable on compliance methodology in public sector projects. They had invited firm representatives and 2 independent consultants. My name was listed as one of the independent voices. Callum told me later he had given them my name when they called asking for a referral. The board had then done their own research before extending the invitation to me directly. I accepted and prepared very carefully. I decided exactly what I would and would not say. I would not criticize any firm by name. I would not make accusations. I would speak entirely from data, methodology, and documented industry experience. Marcus Webb's deputy, Priya Nair, attended on behalf of Harlow & Steele. She was clearly capable but out of her depth on the technical details. When a board member asked about compliance risk layering in multi-phase infrastructure contracts, Priya hesitated. I answered the question calmly from the independent seat. The board member nodded slowly and said, "That is exactly the kind of clarity we need more of in these submissions." Priya looked at me from across the table. I met her eyes and said nothing more. The government contract decision came 3 weeks after the roundtable. Calverton Group was awarded the contract. The evaluation committee's published summary cited the compliance integration framework as the key differentiating factor. The contract value was publicly listed at $14 million over 3 years. Finn Abra sent me a voice note that was mostly cheering. Callum called me directly. He was warm but measured. He said the win had reshaped Calverton's market position and that the methodology I had contributed was now being built into a full new service offering. He wanted to talk about a longer arrangement. That same day, Harlow & Steele's bid result went public. They had not been shortlisted. The evaluation feedback noted their compliance section lacked the technical depth the project required. Marcus Webb posted nothing on LinkedIn that day. Beck sent me a short message, "The board meeting room has been booked by the senior partners for Thursday. 3 are flying in. No one below director level knows why." I thanked her and closed my laptop. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and more lasting. I felt steady, as though the ground beneath me was finally solid after months of standing on something hollow. By Friday morning, news had moved through industry networks quickly. Harlow & Steele's board had placed Marcus Webb's leadership of the Client Operations Division under formal review. The stated reason was performance concerns related to client retention and bid outcomes. No one mentioned my name publicly. They didn't need to. Vivian Park had not been quiet. She had formally escalated her compliance concerns to the board through Hartwell's own governance process. Her documentation was thorough and pointed to specific decisions made after my departure that deviated from the agreed methodology. Every deviation carried Marcus Webb's sign-off. Aaron Slade messaged me. He said the atmosphere at Harlow and Steele had become very tense. Two managers from Marcus's inner circle were now distancing themselves publicly. People were pulling up old emails, suddenly very interested in who had actually made which decisions. I received a call from Harlow and Steele's legal team. They wanted to discuss my severance terms. The original offer had been standard, 2 months of pay and a basic reference. The new offer was significantly more generous. I called my lawyer immediately. She told me to take 3 days before responding. I took all 3 days. I had learned that patience was not weakness. It had always been power. Callum and I met again at the same Riverside restaurant. This time, I was not healing from surgery. I sat straight, ordered coffee, and listened as he laid out what he had in mind. He wanted to create a formal role for me at Calverton. Not as a consultant, as head of compliance strategy, a new position on the senior leadership team. The role would involve building the methodology I had contributed into a full-service division. He offered a salary 30% above what I had earned at Harlow and Steele, equity participation in new contracts the division won, and a budget to hire 3 specialists of my choosing. I asked him why he trusted me enough to build a division around my thinking after knowing me only a few weeks. He said something I wrote down afterward. I don't hire people based on how long I've known them. I hire them based on what I've seen them do under pressure. You were fired from a hospital bed. You didn't panic. You didn't retaliate. You didn't cut corners. That told me everything. I accepted the offer on a Tuesday afternoon. I started the following Monday. It was the easiest professional decision I had ever made. My first day at Calverton felt completely different from any first day I could remember. There was no anxiety about proving myself to people who already doubted me. There was simply work to be done, and I knew exactly how to do it. Finn Abra had been moved to my new division. He was thrilled and slightly nervous, which I found charming. I spent the first week simply listening. I held individual sessions with every person on the existing compliance team. I asked what was working, what wasn't, and what they wished leadership understood better. I wrote everything down and made no structural decisions that entire first week. Meanwhile, the situation at Harlow and Steele continued. The board review of Marcus's division had expanded. 3 clients had formally requested account reviews. The government contract loss had triggered investor questions at their quarterly briefing, and the company's share price had dipped noticeably. Industry media had begun publishing pieces on the changing compliance landscape. Several cited Calverton's contract win as a sector benchmark. None of those articles mentioned me by name. But Callum had begun introducing me at industry events as the architect of Calverton's compliance strategy. I let that introduction do its own quiet work. In my second month at Calverton, I hired the 3 specialists my budget allowed. One of them was Bex Okafor. She had resigned from Harlow and Steele the week before I called her. She said she had already been thinking about leaving. When I told her what I was building, she was silent for a moment and then said, "Tell me where to sign." The other 2 were Yusuf Hamdan, a compliance analyst whose technical rigor matched my own, and Orla Fenwick, a communications specialist who could translate complex methodology into language clients actually understood. Together, the 4 of us built the framework that became Calverton's compliance division. At the same time, Harlow and Steele announced a leadership restructure. Marcus Webb's title changed. He was moved to an internal advisory role, the kind of move companies make when they want someone to step back quietly without creating public questions. His LinkedIn profile was updated but said very little. His activity there dropped to almost nothing. I did not post anything about it. I had nothing to say about Marcus Webb. I had already said everything I needed to say through careful, documented, ethical work. The results had spoken in a language no post could match. 3 months after joining Calverton, the Regional Infrastructure Standards Board published new sector guidance on compliance methodology in public sector contracts. The guidance drew heavily from the framework I had developed. The board cited Calverton's government contract submission as the reference model for the entire sector. The published document included an acknowledgement section. My name appeared in it as the lead methodology author. I read it 3 times. Not because I doubted it was there, but because it felt significant in a way I wanted to sit with properly and fully. Hartwell Infrastructure moved their full account to Calverton 2 months after that. Vivian Park sent me a personal message when the transfer was finalized. She said working with me again felt like returning to solid ground. Harlow and Steele lost 2 additional clients that quarter. Their annual report noted challenges in client retention across the operations division. A strategic review announcement followed. Callum called me into his office to share Calverton's quarterly numbers. Revenue from compliance services, which had been near zero the previous year, now represented 18% of total company income. He put the report on the desk and tapped that number once with one finger. He said, "You built that." I did not argue with him. The formal public acknowledgement came at the National Infrastructure and Governance Conference held in the city center. Callum had been invited to speak and asked me to join him on the panel. I accepted without hesitation. There were over 400 attendees, executives from every major firm in our sector, government department heads, board members, and industry press. It was the most visible room I had ever sat in. When a board member asked Callum to discuss Calverton's approach to the government contract win, he gave a clear answer. Then he turned to me and said, "Nadia Thornton built the compliance framework that made that bid possible. I'd like her to speak to the methodology directly." I spoke for 6 minutes without notes. I had been thinking about this material for over 20 years. I explained the framework, why it worked, and what it meant for how public sector compliance should be approached going forward. When I finished, a government department head in the front row asked if Calverton would share the framework as a sector-wide resource. I looked at Callum. He nodded. I said yes. The applause was not thunderous. It was the measured, respectful kind. That felt far better than noise ever could. The morning after the conference, I sat at my kitchen table with good coffee and sunlight coming through the window. My phone had been buzzing since the previous afternoon, and I had let it buzz. I wanted one quiet morning first. When I finally looked, there were 41 messages. Connection requests, partnership inquiries, an interview request from an industry publication, and a note from the Standards Board asking if I would join their advisory panel. Vivian Park had sent a short message, "That was exactly right, Nadia." There was nothing from Marcus Webb. Nothing from Harlow and Steele. The absence did not bother me at all. I thought about that hospital ceiling. About those 11 words on a phone screen. About the sinking feeling of being discarded at your most vulnerable moment. And I thought about everything that followed, the accidental email, the careful meetings, the patient work, and the building of something entirely my own. I had never shouted. Never accused. Never cut a single corner. I had simply done excellent work and made sure the right people could see it. 6 months after being fired from a hospital bed, I walked into my office at Calverton, greeted my team, and opened a new project file. The cursor blinked. I started typing. I had never felt more like myself.